Slavery, the concept of owning another person while enforcing labors upon them. This process was used in Southern America as a tool for cultivating the growth of plantations, specifically cotton plantations. The idea of slavery was common in South America, in areas like Texas, South Carolina, and such areas near the South. Southern America had a critical overview of slavery labor. Under this demand for such plantations, slavery grew up to 4 million throughout the 1800s till the 1850s. As it was a major part of society, slavery led to some controversy. People in Upper South criticized slavery as a means of labor. However, in other parts of South America, this idea was extolled by the majority of white people, for they saw black people as the foundation of Southern economy. This foundation promised and guaranteed money made from planting crops as well as number of field workers. Money was something that pro-slavery people set as a target.
Not all white people in the time viewed slavery as the answer. A minority defended slaves. This minority in Southern America believed that slavery was going against the individual's freedom. Not only so, but also they believed that it would be better for the economy on the whole if this system was abolished. Criticism of slavery in the South viewed slave labor as less profitable than one based on paid workers. On the other hand, the cruel side was groups who supported slavery. Among the several people who supported slavery were specific types of group that supported slavery. The first were the planters who owned the slaves. They perceived the slaves as inferior and more of people who needed to boss around and take care of. They believed that some of the slaves would never be independent, for they are mud-still class, which means that they have a certain problem or are incapable of caring for themselves. This would include the disabled, the young, and the injured slaves. The white planters would approach the idea of slavery being this way to excuse themselves from what actually goes on, which is vindictive treatments rather than care for the slaves. Other planters believe that they are different types of people and they should never be independent. The second group was the black belt yeomen. They were a small group of people who were very rich and had a small rich area in the deep areas. The black belt yeomen were supporting slavery for their own benefit, because when they would give food to the slave owners and they would give them money back.
Despite people's contradicting opinions towards slavery as a system for labor, this reality was that slavery did indeed become the foundation of successful plantation business. Taking a look at what actually goes on in each cotton plantation and the system of how the slave labor functioned, it is evident that slavery was nothing short of brutality to the black nation. A slave's life revolves around his or her work, as quoted by former slave Peter Clifton. The rule of the place, wake up the slaves at daylight, begin work when they can see, and quit work when they can't see. He did not exaggerate, for in fact the slaves would work all day, exerting their maximum efforts. Southern plantations created a sense of labor-extensive society for the slaves. These efforts demanded thousands of slaves. In the 1800s, slaves in the South formed about 1/3 of Southern plantations. Most slaves lived on large farms or small plantations. Small plantations were usually run by the slaveholders, where the slaves would be supervised by the slaveholders directly. A goal that a slave owner would strive to achieve was to make their slaves completely dependent on them. This thought brings the slave to believe that he needs this life, even if it is harsh. It is the only one he or she will have. It is a system of regulations that govern the life of the slaves. Slaves, both men and women, work 365 days a year and up to 20 hours each day, undertaking exhausting, back-breaking work in the hopes they would please their master. A slave's master was anyone from the driver to the plantation owner. In southern plantations, the hierarchy of those plantations was on 4 specific levels. At the top of the hierarchy would be the slaveholder. He was the plantation owner, who had complete authority of the slaves, and was the one with the power to either buy his slaves, which was the property of his, or sell them. The owners of the plantations were usually the rich, high-class gentlemen from England. Below him were the overseers, who were usually skilled planters, small farmers, and with great experience. These overseers were hired by the plantation owners to manage the slaves. However, the overseers' relationship with the slaves was ultimately brutal, for the overseers would pick on the slaves and boss them around. A slave would not dare to ever defy his overseer, for he could end up violently whipped or possibly hanged as a punishment.
The owners lived in a luxurious mansion where his wife would stay with him, but the overseas would live in a smaller house which would meet his standards. Almost at the bottom of the system would be the drivers. These were the slaves picked to assist the overseas. They carried a very challenging line of work because in this slave was forced to boss around his kind. Henry Chatham was a black man appointed driver and treated his fellow slaves with cruelty. Though he was once a slave like the fireworkers, he was perceived as a devil to the rest of the slaves from the way he treated them. This left unresolved feelings of hatred from the slaves below him, yet in the white man's eyes, this driver was doing his job. Word by word. Originally, the drivers were exemplified as the head of the slaves. The drivers led the common slaves into doing the act that was assigned to him by the overseers. The system was called gang labor. It allowed for the overseers to appoint groups of slaves to do specific jobs like plowing, planting, hoeing, and picking, while the driver is trusted to assist the overseers.
Below the overseer were the ones at the bottom of everything. Those were the basic field slaves who worked day and night while never achieving any credit for their work. A slave would be poorly fed and housed in wood cabins where he or she lays in the cold along with other slaves in the plantation. Slaves would sleep in a very small room cramped up. In the winter, they would stick together to be warmed up by the body heat. The neglect and horrible shelter allowed for the winds to come in their cabin and remain for the night. Their food was determined on how much work they got done in the plantation. What they got would not last them a week, so in order for them to be able to eat, they knew they would have to work really hard, for they would hunt. Sometimes on Sundays they would grow plants of fruit in small gardens or even steal the food. Men and women suffered these horrid conditions, but all that was in mind was always the concentration around the slaves' work. Men and women slaves sometimes had different jobs, but all in all, they were both expected to work as hard. Instead of working in the fields, picking cotton or such, women slaves would sometimes be able to serve in the plantation households as servants, maids, nannies, or would even be responsible for the laundry, as well as sewing. This, however, also has a horrific experience for a woman, for they were exposed to the plantation owners. Owners of the plantation would usually take advantage of having women slaves. Many owners took sexual liberties with these innocent women, like raping them in the midst of the night. The owner was able to do what he wishes with any slave at any time. The owner would also sometimes have male slaves not just do field work, but also do other jobs, such as carrying on a job as a carpenter, coach driver, blacksmith, or a gardener. Within the slaves, there were different groupings based on strict hierarchy. This leveled from the privileged house slaves and skilled artisans down to the deprived field slaves. The treatment of those working on the jobs, besides the field work, also received horrible care. Slaves were treated worse out of all the levels of workers in the plantation. It was a rule almost every white man set at the time that slaves wouldn't be considered human. Sometimes white men believed that these black slaves were of a different kind, and it would be against God's will if we treated them fairly. Slaves were very limited on what they were to do. They were not even permitted to learn how to read or write, and their behavior and movement was utterly restricted. Slaves had different kinds of lives that depended on how the owner treated them. They had a subject in common, however, which referred to how they were obliged to overcome the challenges and the consequences of what happened to them and their family members.